Chapter 4. Damon Eddington thought there couldn't be a drearier time or place in the world than Manhattan at dawn on the day after Christmas. It made him think of his long-dead grandmother. At first he didn't know why, as it had been years since he'd thought of her or his parents. Then memories from decades earlier surfaced, and he recalled that for a few years when he was a kid, before his grandmother had died, his parents had shipped him off to her for the holidays. He'd thought he would hate it. She was a dried-up old woman who lived in a 4-room apartment in the Bronx, a convenient holiday babysitter for his mother. But after the first year, he'd wanted to go. Christmas itself was always a disappointment, a flashy holiday that held no religious implications for him or his family, and certainly less gratification from the childish viewpoint of gifts. His grandmother had little money to buy toys or sound discs for her strange grandson, and Damon's mother and father seldom troubled themselves with anything other than the necessary clothes. A couple of pairs of socks and some underwear usually. Once a small gift certificate to the Sin Sound Circle store that had made his mouth drop open in surprise. That pretty much summed up the history of Christmas gifts during the childhood of Damon Eddington. But at Grandma Sheridan's he'd felt okay. Not as though he belonged, never that, but that it was all right with her if he was different. She wasn't trying to hide him from her friends or co-workers. And if she did have someone else against whom she was comparing him, the grandchild of someone in her building, or perhaps a card-playing companion, she never showed it or mentioned anything. He had worked enough odd jobs to buy himself an inexpensive disc player and a decent set of headphones a long time ago. Headphones were the only way his parents would tolerate his music. But Grandma Sheridan waved the headphones away and told Damon he ought to be listening to the music the way it was meant to be heard, floating on the air in front of his ears, not reduced to a bunch of unseen electrical impulses forced through wires. "Damon, my boy," she'd said in her shaky, ancient voice, "I'm half dead anyway. Unless you turn it up so loud it puts cracks in the walls, I probably won't pay any attention." Dawn on Christmas morning. That's what had brought his memories back. Looking out the soot-smeared window of his 6th-floor loft, he could see the rooftops of a few smaller buildings scattered down the block, like crumbling mushrooms struggling amid the high-rises that were inexorably infringing on the neighborhood. Post-Christmas then had looked pretty much the same as it did now. Grey, damp, sometimes with dirty snow piled against the curbs from the plows. About the only things that made it visually any different now that Damon was an adult was that there were more high-rises. Always. And no cars around here, because nobody drove the old clankers in the poor neighborhoods anymore. Everyone around here stuck to air cycles and express rides on the monorails. If Damon closed his eyes and concentrated, he could still bring the sounds and smells back clearly into his mind. On December 26th, with barely enough light to see by, his grandmother would get up, make a pot of strong coffee for herself, as she did every year, and pull from the refrigerator the carcass of the small turkey she'd cooked the day before. With a full-length apron in place to protect her house dress, Grandmother Sheridan would sit at the table and patiently poke and prod the bones of the turkey until they were stripped clean of meat. That done, she would carefully divide the leftovers into small piles, wrap and label them in her unsteady, spidery script, and store them in her freezer. She always set one packet aside to be made into a tried-and-true recipe of homemade turkey tetrazzini for dinner that night. How many times had Damon spent the day after Christmas just listening to his favorite music on the disc player and waiting for that wonderful dinner, not to mention the creamy, semi-sweet chocolate pie that always followed. Only 3. Damon hadn't smiled much when he was growing up, but he remembered being 12 years old and smiling at Grandmother Sheridan the morning his parents came to pick him up from her place the final time. He could still feel the smile on his lips as he waved goodbye to her the last time he saw her alive, a stretch of his mouth as it adjusted to something odd and poorly fitted, but still so very special. "See you next year." That's what he had said, and she had smiled in return, her sagging, wrinkly face pulling up as she nodded. Standing at the window now, 3 decades and some odd years later, Damon wondered if the old woman had possessed any inkling that there wouldn't be a next time for her. Had she known that late on a rainy night in March of the following year that her lungs would simply get too tired to work? Sometimes Damon thought about the look on her face and wondered. She was the only person he'd ever loved, and he still missed her. Damon turned away from the window. His home was a room in a warehouse-turned-apartment building off West 38th, something the artists and musicians down in Greenwich Village insisted on calling a loft. In reality, it was cold, crawling with the smaller breed of building cockroaches that did everything but carry off his sheet music, and had 4 leaky spots in the roof and the decrepit outer brick wall. He couldn't decide if the biting cold of winter was worse or the dampness of spring when he had buckets all over the apartment to catch the water that dripped from the ceiling. Each spring was a crapshoot of trying to guess where the leaks would turn up and if more would appear. Plus, there was always the question of whether or not this would be the season that the rotting ceiling would finally give way. Getting his cheap-ass landlord to send up heat in the winter was likewise a constant battle, and as far as the summer months went, in a word, Damon cooked. Personally, he was disgusted with the idea of being a starving musician. He was tired of being hungry for better food than vegetables from the 5 Boroughs genetic hothouse and the soy burgers that the manufacturers swore tasted just like beef. He thought they tasted dry, mashed beans with beef-flavored salt. He wanted to taste the real vegetables that were still freshly grown in pockets of South America, and try the experimental fruits that were coming out of the irrigated portion of the Mojave Desert. Somehow he doubted that Jarlath Keen ate soy burgers and tuna meat farmed from aquatic clones 4 nights a week like Damon did. The executive looked far too well satisfied for that. Damon shivered and stepped away from the multi-paned window and its profusion of drafts. This is it, he thought bitterly as he wandered back to the unfolded futon that served as both his couch and bed, and lowered his shivering body onto it. My life. After a few moments, he crossed his legs and pulled the blankets around his shoulders, watching vacantly as breath misted in front of him in the nearly frigid air. His landlord lived in the larger apartment 2 stories down, and if nothing else, today was still part of the holiday weekend. In a couple of hours, the greedy bastard would be up and moving around, and Damon would get some heat, if the old man hadn't gone out of town to visit relatives. Occasionally, he pulled that shit, and no one could get in touch with him for days. Heat generally rose, and by all rights, Damon's apartment should have been the warmest in this piece of crap called a building. That it was always freezing fed Damon's suspicion that the landlord had run electric baseboard heaters in his own place to cut down on the overall bill for the building. Damon had considered buying his own, but ultimately couldn't afford it, or the higher electric bills that would result. Speakers and crude recording equipment surrounded Damon's futon, stacked against the walls in a jumble of wires, plastic cases, labeled and unlabeled sound discs, and old cassette tape machines. His testing ground for new music and a self-critic's hell for the old. None of the electronic equipment he had here was good enough to generate recording quality stuff, of course, but he could work with it enough to start projects, even output a few demo tapes to offer to the state-of-the-art mixer, digital recorder and signal processor that the corporation let him have constant access to, flaunted at him every opportunity. Someday, he thought, I'll be able to... Knock it off, Damon said out loud. So far this morning, nothing else had broken the silence, and his voice was shockingly loud in the chilly loft. He hated that word. Someday. Someday I'll be able to do this, and someday I'll do that. As a boy, he'd always thought like that, in terms of that elusive something that was going to happen at any time, as though all those things, those wonderful accomplishments, were close enough to reach if he only managed to stretch enough. It wasn't as though there was any place but Synsound to which he could offer his creative output. The company had swallowed up its competition long before Damon was born. New music companies popped up, of course, but Synsound's business plan worked, quite aptly, on the greed factor. When a tiny new competitor popped up, the megacorporation bought them out by offering them too much money to refuse, under-the-table deals made to avoid the federal monopolization laws. Someday. Always that. Someday I'll make my parents proud of me. Had, over the course of a decade and a half, evolved into, someday I'll make them notice me. But they'd never done either, and it didn't matter that his music grew more despondent or dark or strange. Nothing Damon did made him anything to his parents but what he was. A nuisance, a slip-up in birth control that they were bound by government laws to look after for 18 years. A continuing, quiet embarrassment because of his strangeness. They probably hated him all the more because of his unpredictability. He hadn't acted like a normal teenager, hadn't been into whatever sin drugs happened to be on the street at the time, and there was always something available. Hadn't even gotten into the usual adolescent trouble with girls and VR gangs and blood rock music. He was a shadow in their lives, a shadow over their lives. Damon had started working longer hours as soon as he could. Unemployment be damned. There were plenty of shit jobs available if you were willing to wash dishes, bus tables, and haul trash. Plenty of dirty and usually illegally run restaurants tucked between buildings in the neighborhoods. As a teenager, he'd scrubbed trash bins, gutted fish, and scraped thousands of layers of grease off stoves and griddles to pay for his guitars. As much of an outcast as he was, he'd still met others like himself during high school, music lovers and rockers, pickers and a few singers. He'd come a long way from being a zit-faced, gangly kid with dark hair, white skin, and a guitar that seemed as much a part of him as one of his arms. And look at him now. He'd advanced into manhood, determined to make his mark on the world with his music, convinced he could reintroduce forgotten classical forms to a public saturated with industrial discord, mutated androids, and screaming synthesizers. Back then, he'd even had a partner and friend, although that relationship had died when Damon had gone in his own direction. What a fool he'd been, and his continued failures turned ultimately into depression, and that turned into still darker tunes. All those years passing by, listening to bleak and brooding music, and feeling a kinship with it that gradually evolved into a fierce and undeniable loyalty, letting those emotions bleed soft, inescapable blackness into his work. Now that music, his work, had surrounded him and forced out everything else in his life. It had enslaved him. No friends, male or female, anymore. For a short while in his early 20s, there'd been a woman in his life. A 6-month period during which he tried, unsuccessfully as it turned out, to devote some of his time and life to something other than composition. That he could no longer remember her name shamed him. He had loved her and told her so, but his feelings were absent-minded and weak, unnourished by the attention a relationship like that needed and deserved. She'd had red hair and hazel eyes, or was it strawberry blonde hair and green eyes? More useless remorse and self-reproach. So today, in the here and now of his life, what was left? Obsession, rage, and hate, of course. Damon hated the public, hated Sin Sound, hated Keen. But most of all, he hated himself for his undeniable love of this most obscure subgenre of music to the exclusion of everything sane, everything normal. So many wasted hours spent in supreme self-loathing, asking that most treacherous of questions. Why could he not have loved something more marketable?